Today I wanted to work on a bit of a side project and make myself a custom gouache palette. Right now I have my Arteza gouache set stored in this paint tube organizer, and I just find myself not grabbing them as much as I'd like. I don't know, having paints in pans for me is just so much easier. So I figured I'd take some of this paint and do exactly that. I made myself these custom pan inserts to go in a palette tower, which if you don't know, the palette towers are a system I designed and manufacture where basically all of your paint pans can be stored easily and stacked to take up as little space as possible, which right now, this is my personal palette tower and it's looking a bit sad and neglected, so I figured adding these gouache storage layers to mine would be a nice addition. Each well is a little larger than a typical full pan. Normally this type of insert would have 20 sections, but I designed specific ones for this gouache that have 16, so that the palette would be an even 3 layers. I also made them much more shallow so that there wasn't a crazy amount of paint needed for each well. So I've got all the inserts put into the tower layers themselves, so now here is what my palette tower looks like all stacked together. Then I decided to just squeeze a bit of each paint color into each pan. I wasn't entirely sure how much paint I actually wanted to fill up the sections with, so the first two are a little messy other than I just kind of forgot how to fill pans appropriately, so excuse the very caveman-like techniques here, but it does get better. So the trick really for filling up pans is to go around the edges and then sort of zigzag in the central area, and then you end up with a really nice, clean, smooth pan full of paint. And I was just going through the colors as they were in my paint tube storage unit, which is also the order that they are on my swatch sheet. So there are a few colors that kind of look like they maybe are out of place, or I would personally possibly organize them a little differently, but just for simplicity's sake, I kept them in the same color organization layout that they basically came in. It was the color configuration that the packaging was all in, and like I said, the swatch sheet, which is based on the color order that they're originally listed in. The colors also ended up lining up perfectly with my pre-existing swatch sheet, so I didn't have to make a new one. The slightly more shallow wells worked great. Each one ended up holding about 1/5 of a paint tube, which is awesome because I really didn't want to use up like half of a tube in this palette, so that there was still some like fresh paint in the tubes if I ever wanted to use it that way. I also really like how the layout of this palette turned out. The 16 well setup ended up splitting up the colors really evenly so that there's almost like 3 separate, very cohesive palettes. The first is neutrals and yellows, the second all warm tones, and the third all cool colors. And I figured if we were going to make a custom gouache palette, we should probably put it to the test too. So I decided to do a bit of a Studio Ghibli scene study. It was recently the 20th anniversary of Spirited Away, which is my all-time favorite movie, and just in general I've been in a bit of a Ghibli kick, so I thought this would be the perfect thing to test out this palette with. Gouache is always amazing for landscape paintings, so I figured this would be the perfect opportunity to do something like that. I wasn't entirely sure what scene or landscape I wanted to work on, but when I was looking at different reference photos, I came across the scene of No Face on the bridge, and I thought it might be really fun to try and achieve No Face's like a translucent effect. He kind of gradually becomes translucent at the bottom, and I thought that might be fun to try and paint and see how that turned out, so that's what I went with. Other than it is just generally a pretty colorful scene, you have of course the red bridge, the like greenery and more natural neutral landscape in the background, so it was going to give me an opportunity to use a lot more of the gouache colors. I did leave the sketch pretty rough, pretty much just giving myself base level just lines and a little bit of a sort of template to go off of, but for the most part I wanted to be adding in most of the detail with my brush, and I guess sort of drawing with my brush more than taking all the time to refine those details in the sketch itself. Also, apologies for the slightly strange lighting in this initial set of clips. I decided to try and use natural lighting instead of putting on my studio lights. I thought it was like an even enough day out, but obviously there was a lot of weird cloud cover, so the colors and stuff sort of change a bit, but it's only this first clip and then I went back to using my studio lights. For this study, I really wanted to focus on achieving the various amounts of detail and environmental, just lighting and texture and all of that fairly fast. I wanted this to be a pretty quick study, so I did have a bit of a slower start, but I wanted to really focus on the values of color and the different hues that, depending on the depth and just the general atmosphere, trying to get those undertones into those colors basically off of the bat. I really wanted to try and make this almost like a one-layer painting. There are a few sections where I did go back over things to lighten some areas and add that different texture, but I was really trying to make this a nice, fast, I guess sort of gestural landscape study while still trying to, get all of the different perspective and all of that fun stuff in, but I know that this did end up being a little more on the loose side, especially you will see when we get into the bridge section. This might not have been like the greatest option for studies if my goal was to do more of a loose gestural landscape painting, considering how much perspective and architecture is in especially the bridge part. The background was perfect for this, but there was like more detail than maybe in your typical landscape painting given the bridge in the foreground. But oh well, we still ran with it. I know I mentioned it had been a while since I had used this Arteza gouache, but for this particular set, I know I believe it's the largest set that they sell, but in the 48 colors, there's some really nice, unique colors that are super useful for blending into things. There's that very interesting, steely, grayish blue, which I was mixing into a lot of the landscape sort of portion of this painting because it gave that perfect, slightly cloudy and bluish tint to the different colors so that it gave the illusion that it was back a lot further than the bridge. Typically objects and landscapes and stuff that are further away from the front will get like a grayish blue hazy effect. It's basically just the atmosphere. So the trees sort of in the corner definitely have that like bluish tinge to them. And just in general, I really like the color selection in this set. Other than, of course, the gouache itself is amazing, and I think, if you didn't want to spend all of that money on the larger sets, the smaller sets would be perfect as well. I just know, I believe when I initially talked about getting this set in a video, I mentioned how much I liked the color layout. There really isn't a particular color that I feel like the set is missing, or I maybe wish they would have replaced a few colors. I mean, I might have said something in that video. It's been a while, so I'm not entirely sure, but typically when I review a new paint set and stuff, I really look at the color selection, and if I feel like they're maybe missing a color, or I wish, there might be two colors that are very similar and I wish they would have put this color in the set instead. And for this set, for the most part, I'm very pleased with the color selection that you get. But yeah, also this gouache is amazing. Between the Arteza gouache and the Jelly gouache sets, if you've been thinking about trying out gouache and you're maybe a watercolor artist or just, looking at branching out in your painting medium horizons, I'd highly recommend picking up a gouache set. It's super fun to use and it's kind of that perfect in-between paint medium. So whether you are typically used to using watercolor or acrylic or oil, it's a very in-between paint texture. And there's a lot of really great inexpensive sets out there. Let's talk about this bridge for a second because it is rough. I was really still trying to achieve that atmospheric color change straight out of the bat, just going willy-nilly in with the paint immediately. I didn't want to do a whole lot of layering, so I really kept the bridge furthest away from, I guess, the camera or the viewpoint, trying to keep that lighter and less saturated reddish color, and then getting darker the closer you are to the front section. And then, of course, in between the different color differences and light differences between the different planes of the bridge, and just in general it was kind of like a really rough painting of the different things. I apparently wasn't too concerned about the lines of the actual bridge staying too straight, so it probably would have been a good idea to slow down on the straight lines. But overall, I think that yes, I did not take very long on this, and I think in some areas you definitely can see that, but overall, by the end, I think that the lighting and the perspective is definitely there. It is rough, but there's nothing that looks super out of place. I really tried to be a little more bold with my color choices, like right off of the bat. You know, like I mentioned, I was trying to go in with like one step layer sort of situation and not a lot of layering, so I was trying to get them to be the right values immediately, which a lot of the time I build up a billion layers and gradually we will get to the depth necessary. But today was not one of those days, and I'm pretty proud of that. I think it was also around this section of the painting where I was highly sort of debating and considering exactly how much cleanup I wanted to do on this piece. I obviously could tell that the lines in the bridge were pretty rough, and seeing as it was gouache, I did have the option, since it is a more opaque paint, that I could go over the different sections and really straighten those lines up in the bridge, and I sort of did a 50-50. I decided to refine things a little, but overall, if it was a little messy in areas, we were just gonna chalk it down to character. But yeah, really just gradually refining things here, building up those bright corners on the supports, or whatever you want to call them, on the bridge, those really sharp lines that have bright corners, just getting all of those in there, and then detailing up anywhere that I was planning on layering, like in the clouds. I knew I wanted to add white back into them, and just some different color differences in the greenery and stuff, but again, wanted to keep it pretty fast and loose, so I didn't spend too much time refining things that much. I did kind of forget about the details in the bridge, and I really wanted No Face to be the last thing that I painted on this, but you will see that the bridge is actually the last thing. But for No Face, I was really excited because, well, you can see pretty much the entire bridge and surrounding scenery is still painted basically where he's going to be painted, because I wanted to try this like effect where pretty much I'm just doing a bit of a wash of the black over all of that to give the illusion that he's gradually disappearing, and I think it worked great, and it was so easy, and it looks kind of very, I don't know, it's fancy. It's never something that I've had the chance to do in any piece, and I don't know, it kind of just thrilled me to no end, so I'm very happy that that worked out. It's definitely the effect that I was going for. It might have been a little better with black watercolor, as that would have been a little more transparent, but overall, really love the effect that I achieved with that. And here's the final piece. Of course, the last step is going to be to remove this tape so that there's a nice clean edge around the landscape. But thank you for joining me on the journey of building this new gouache palette and also putting it to the test. But that is everything, so thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.